Hello, and welcome everyone to the first of our four-part symposium series, The Missing Waves of Feminism. I am Holly Hotchner, and I have the honor to be the president and CEO of the National Women's History Museum. Our museum is the nation's largest and only online cultural institution dedicated to women's history. This year, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary. And we're pleased to share that in 2022, we'll be opening a physical site in Washington, D.C. for programs and exhibitions. Women's contributions, women's stories, and women's achievements must be told and studied and shared and celebrated. In honor of our 25th anniversary, we present this important symposium series that does just that. Together, we'll explore in depth the various waves of feminism, paying particular attention to the lost eras of the traditionally recognized canon of the four waves. In addition to this symposium, throughout 2021, we'll also launch a series of comprehensive virtual exhibits examining the four waves of feminism and what that means. Thank you to all of our outstanding panelists and to all of you for attending, and for your continued commitment to ensuring that a more accurate, inclusive, and representative history is told.
Good evening, and welcome to the third installment of the National Women's History Museum's 25th Anniversary Celebration Symposium Series, The Missing Waves of Feminism. I am Liz Everline, the Education Programs Manager at the National Women's History Museum. Tonight's discussion will highlight women changemakers beyond the canonical 1980 to 2010 period that is often referred to as the third wave of feminism. The goal is to re-examine the origins, context, and voices of the so-called third wave of feminism with a robust discussion that considers the consequential events and reconsiderations of gender norms that prompted yet another reckoning of women's roles in culture and society. Our panelists for this evening are Leslie Heywood. Leslie is professor of English and creative writing at Binghamton University, a lifelong athlete who has competed at the national level in sports as varied as track, powerlifting, and yoga. She wrote one of the first memoirs to address the sexual abuse of women and girls in sport, Pretty Good for a Girl. With Jennifer Drake, she conceived and put together the first academic anthology devoted to third wave feminism, Third Wave Agenda, Being Feminist, Doing Feminism. She was also responsible for the 2-volume compilation, The Women's Movement Today, an encyclopedia of third wave feminism, which articulated and cataloged the wide range of issues that encompass the third wave. Kate Kelly is a zealous advocate and passionate activist. She has a JD from American University, Washington College of Law, the only law school in the world founded by and for women. She is a vocal women's rights champion in the US and around the world. Kate believes the simple and popular adage that women's rights are human rights and is committed to legal advocacy and education for women and other marginalized groups. She is a nationally known advocate for ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment and host of the podcast Ordinary Equality. She has a forthcoming book, also called Ordinary Equality, about the history of the women and queer people who have shaped the US Constitution and the Equal Rights Amendment. Our final panelist for this conversation is Rebecca Walker. Rebecca has contributed to the global conversation about race, gender, power, and the evolution of the human family for over 2 decades. She is the author of several best-selling books, a popular speaker who has appeared at over 400 universities, literary conferences, and corporate campuses around the world, and served as a consultant for several Fortune 500 companies. She is active in the film and television space and co-founded the Third Wave Fund, an organization that gives grants to women and transgender youth working for social justice. Walker was named by Time magazine as one of the most influential leaders of her generation. Thank you to all of our panelists for being with us today for this very important conversation. Finally, our moderator for this series is Dr. Michele B. Goodwin. Dr. Goodwin is a global thought leader and advisor, as well as an award-winning author, advocate, professor, and social commentator. She is the host of the popular podcast On the Issues with Michele Goodwin at Miss Magazine. Her writings address pressing matters of law, society, and global health. Her publications appear across 5 books and more than 100 law review articles, book chapters, and commentaries. Her opinion editorials and commentaries can be found in the New York Times, LA Times, Salon.com, Politico, Forbes, the Christian Science Monitor, and other platforms. She is a frequent contributor to Miss Magazine and is the Chancellor's Professor of Law at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Goodwin is an elected member of the American Law Institute, an elected fellow of the American Bar Foundation, and elected fellow at the Hastings Center. A very warm welcome to you all. And Michelle, I'll pass things over to you.
Thank you very much, Liz. It is a pleasure to be with you all this evening and to continue in this very important series as we unpack the waves, the streams, the oceans of feminism. Now, even though our conversation this evening is about the third wave, I'd be remiss if I didn't give space for us to be present in this time, given what has taken place in Texas with legislation that was enacted in May and signed into law by Governor Abbott, SB 8, which prohibits abortions after 8 weeks of pregnancy, which deputizes Texans to be able to report on other Texans that they believe have aided or abetted in the procurement of an abortion, and also allows them lawyers' fees and a bounty in case they are successful at intervening in a pregnancy termination. Added to that, the United States Supreme Court, at least for now, has refused to intervene, in doing so with what's been called the shadow docket, which is when the Supreme Court has issued an opinion, but without a signature, meaning we don't know who wrote it, or sometimes they've done this without even issuing an opinion. So I want to start off with that before we actually get to the waves, to just get your sense of where we are in the United States, your response to what's happened in Texas, or your response to the Supreme Court. And why don't I start with you, Rebecca, and then I'm going to go to Kate and Leslie.
Well, it's really wonderful to be here talking about the third wave and about what's happening right now. I'm so glad that we're opening with this question. Obviously I have a lot of anger, disappointment. I feel a deep sense of injury around this new law that's been passed. I can't say that I am surprised. Texas has always been a battleground for women's rights. I feel a sense of needing to recommit to the struggle in an even more vocal and intentional way in the face of this. I think that we're all, continuing to awaken to the contemporary nightmare that is our current Supreme Court and the Trumpist movement that is threatening to take us back, decades and decades. I think that one of the important thoughts that we tried to contribute with Third Wave initially ties into this a little bit, which is, we talked a lot about the importance of not just changing laws, but changing consciousness, because there was an understanding when I was beginning to speak about Third Wave and how we would define it, that laws could always be reversed, laws could always be changed back. But hopefully, if you could move people, if you could awaken them in such a way that they began to know in their marrow and believe in their marrow through relationships, through persuasion, through conversations, that these kinds of freedoms were necessary, were beautiful, were going to enhance their lives, that it would be harder to go back. It would be harder to put the consciousness back in the bottle, whereas it would be easier to change the laws back. So I'm thinking a lot about that at this moment, and how successful were we in continuing to create this kind of change in consciousness that we were talking about, what is it now, 30 years ago when we began talking about Third Wave.
Rebecca, I really appreciate you starting us off with that about hearts and minds and consciousness. It reminds me of the platform that was the civil rights movement itself, and even longer and deeper than that. So I hope that we actually get back to that. It's such a principled, important point that you've just made. Kate, how do you come through what's been the last couple of weeks in our country, and in reality, I know that for you all, you see the longevity of this. You know that this wasn't just a manifestation of the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think, as an attorney and as someone who has been fighting for the Equal Rights Amendment for a long time, not as long as others, but at least a decade now, I come to this really, I keep returning to the fact that this is the fruition of decades of methodical planning on the part of the far right and anti-choice legislators and activists. And that really started off when the third wave started. So the anti-choice movement, for all intents and purposes, really didn't exist before Roe versus Wade in the way that it does now. I remember I talked to Sherry Finkbein, who I interviewed for my podcast, who was one of the first people who had a public abortion. And she was actually a TV presenter in Arizona. She had a children's show and she ended up having to get an abortion, and she had to go internationally to get the abortion and became nationwide news. And Sherry Finkbein said something very interesting. She said, in the movie that they made about my story, they had me arriving at the airport with all of these protesters with signs and all of this stuff. And she's like, that's all made up, because the movie was made in the 90s and that's what was happening then. She's like, when I arrived at the airport, there was no one. There was no organized opposition. There were no signs. There was no, there wasn't this organized anti-abortion movement. So that's actually completely anachronistic to her actual experience. And so I think it's interesting to see the trajectory of the power that they have gained since then. And really it's been their long-term goal. They're seeing the fruition of a very long-term intentional campaign to terminate our rights and to claw back. And so I think for me, it's just, it's this longer trajectory. And then I'm also reflecting on specifically on the third wave, because the third wave also started out with an enormous defeat. The Equal Rights Amendment was stalled in 1982 when the deadline expired. And we can talk more about those specifics.
And we will, yes.
Yes, great. Nothing I like to talk about more than the ERA. But so we started out this third wave with an enormous defeat, something that people had been fighting for since 1923, when the ERA was first introduced. And got a little bit lost, honestly, as far as like nationwide, concentrated, pointed campaign that everyone.
And we're going to get to that.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate you raising that. And we're going to come back to that, right? I just wanted to get that temperature check about Texas, the Supreme Court. And to your point, though, Kate, in terms of, that film and the kind of drama that's been created around this space, it's worth reminding folks that in 1973, when the Supreme Court took up a Texas abortion law, which ultimately became Roe v. Wade, 7-2 opinion, it wasn't even close. And 5 of those 7 justices were Republican appointed. The opinion was actually written by Justice Blackmun, who was appointed to the court by Richard Nixon. So that gives you some sense of just how divergent it is between what is perceived as conservative today versus in 1973, the majority of the Supreme Court, which was conservative and Republican, saying autonomy, privacy of women really does matter. Leslie, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this.
Well, I was thinking this morning when I was trying to prepare for this and looking back to kind of the historical chronology and what were some of the important events kind of that were motivating the third wave. And I was really reminded how the third wave was formed in the context of kind of backlash, to use Saluti's term, in the larger like popular culture. And sort of the backlash against reproductive rights was one of the same things. And that's when the attacks on the abortion clinics, that was when they were all first happening. It was when everything first, we really started to see some scary, really violent acting out against the women's right to choose. So it's almost like what we in the third wave we're starting to deal with is very similar to what's happening again. And it seems maybe that it's related. It did seem like a couple years ago with, you know, the Me Too movement and some of the gains that were made there, and kind of with the younger generation sort of embracing such an intersectional identity rubric. And just there have been gains made, and it does seem like kind of what's getting a little dark at the moment, maybe in a kind of a repeat backlash. The backlash is just keep coming around.
I'm so happy that you mentioned that, because Rebecca, I'm coming straight to you.
Oh, good.
Because Rebecca, I'd love to hear from you about this backlash and actually setting the stage for what do we mean by third wave, and what was the importance of focusing, putting at the center of that the concerns of women of color and of poor women, which I think made a huge difference. And then we can unpack ERA, and we can unpack the pushback against abortion too, and the violence that was associated with it. So Rebecca, I'm turning it over to you to help set that stage.
Well, that's a big stage to set, but as I was thinking, remembering, why I wrote the piece Becoming the Third Wave, why I co-founded Third Wave Direct Action Corporation, which became the Third Wave Fund, why I felt it was necessary to create a third wave idea in general. It really had to do with exactly what Leslie is saying, that a very similar set of circumstances. We were seeing the erosion of access to reproductive freedom at an alarming rate. I mean, young women couldn't get, poor women couldn't get, Planned Parenthood was under attack in the same way that it is now. The context was also around Rodney King and the beating and the police brutality in Los Angeles, in the same way that we're experiencing George Floyd at this moment, and the police brutality against Black men in our country. I would say that one of the reasons that I was so moved to get involved in this work, speaking to your point, is that I felt that many in my cohort, in my generation, were completely alienated from the idea of feminism, from the movement of feminism, that they were pushing back so hard based on many different things, Black women feeling that issues of race were not included, poor women feeling that issues of class were not included, disabled or differently abled women feeling that they were not included. There was a sense that that feminism was for a specific group of people, and white women, primarily middle-class women. And I felt, as someone who had grown up in a very fundamentally diverse community of feminists, that my peers had sort of missed a whole vision, and that if we didn't work to find a way to bring them in, we were going to lose a whole generation of feminists and activists. And so from the very beginning, one of the first principles of third wave, and I went around to, I don't know, hundreds of schools talking about this. And the first point was, do not call yourself a feminist unless you are committed to anti-racist work, unless you are committed to ending homophobia in yourself and in your community, unless you are committed to working for working people all over the country and the world. I was, like Kim Crenshaw, we were talking about intersectionality, which is, happily, I feel, we are seeing the fruits of that work in the context of this moment in a way that we did not have then. We were really forging that language and those relationships and that understanding, and also borrowing from the work of third world feminists who were already articulating their needs as being different from the needs of white women feminists of a certain class. So I was really trying to bring this awareness in and amplify it and make room for the redefinition of feminism for a new generation that was really saying, I don't care if you say you're a feminist, if you're not committed to standing with me against police brutality against Black people in this country. To me, that's meaning, so that was really one of the foundational aspects, including the concept of how are we going to continue this fight against the erosion of reproductive freedom.
So I want to connect with you, Leslie, on this point, because Rebecca has offered a lot, and it seems to me that that's still part of the struggle. So that what interested Rebecca and motivated her and was the kind of foundation of that work was to make it intersectional, to see the connectedness between violence against Black people, Black men, Black women, and then also women, Black women, Native women, Latina, being able to have their own space. But it seems to me that that still has continued to be a struggle within the broader framework of feminism itself. So as I turn to you, Leslie, about your, lens of defining the third wave, what have been the successes and failures of the third wave?
It's a hard question.
I know, I'm sorry, but you know what? We're all friends here. We can struggle with that together, because I think it is an ongoing kind of struggle, hard question.
Well, to some extent, because third wave kind of was born in that context of backlash, and it got really confused at the beginning with post-feminism. And that was a huge issue, because those of us who called ourselves third wave were completely against, what the conservative post-feminist, if you want to call it a movement, was trying to say. The Katie Roifes, the Naomi Wolfs, the Renee Denfields, the people that got all the wider media exposure. And what the real activist work that was being done within third wave really was not given that broader media platform, even though there were attempts to do that with Hughes magazine, with Bitch, with Bust. So there were we were not, again, we're fighting the backlash context, even in the face of what was being called feminism in the popular mass media. So that was a real issue. And people got confused. I think in the broader public space, people got confused about what feminism was or was meant to be, because you had this whole conservative feminist movement saying, oh, well, we're the power feminists, and anybody that calls for real activism are the victim feminists. That really was the terminology being used at the time. So it was a struggle both to articulate what we stood for and what we didn't stand for, and where feminism was in all of that. It was all very linguistically complicated.
Yeah, and I want to just add to that, because we're talking about the complications of race. And I think that, Leslie, what you're hitting on as well, and that I felt very strongly, and which is why I'm glad we're actually having this discussion, is that there was an erasure of the contributions of women of color within third wave. And that includes an erasure of me, as I have really felt it, and my work and my contribution in the context of this question of what is third wave. Now, what is third wave? I talked about it endlessly, and yet that was not considered, it was not the news, there and so even in that moment, there was a real prioritizing and foregrounding of white women, actually, and an erasure of the intellectual labor, the emotional labor, the psychological labor of women of color who were active in third wave, as well as men who were very active with us. And that was another thing that was very important to me, which was that men had a very specific role in feminism and activism, and needed to be supported and embraced in their work of deconstructing their own internalized misogyny and revisioning masculinity in a powerful way that was not dehumanized, that was not toxic. And there were many progressive men of all different colors and all different sexualities and all different abilities who were willing to stand with us. And they also were silenced. They also were erased. They also were not taken into consideration. And they are very much a part of third wave.
I want to pick up on that, because they're very important threads to the conversation from that we see from first wave, second wave, right? Like this continuation, perhaps the expectation that in the third wave, given certain advancements, that one could see a change But you're also picking up on threads of violence, right? There's the Rodney King, but you're also picking up on something else, which has been that tension of the 20th century that position Black men, especially, as eminently raping, right? It just sort of go down the street and look, there's going to be this lurking Black guy who's going to be predatory against white women. And of course, you know, coming out of that 20th century, we have from Emmett Till to so many other stories of that are completely inconsistent with the narrative before that. You know, as just a slight digression to further the point that you're making, Rebecca, and then I want to go to Kate, is that very recently I've been doing lots and lots of reading of diaries from the antebellum period written by white women from the 1700s, 1800s, 1600s. And the one thing that you can't find are white women who are fearful of Black men on the plantation. You will not find in these diaries, you know, copious notes about, oh, I'm so fearful, I just dread, I can't go out into the fields. You never see it. And in fact, what you see is that white women are doing a lot of managing of the estates and plantations when their husbands are gone, and yet no fear whatsoever. So what is that in terms of that 20th century rhetoric that then becomes weaponized, that creates something different of Black men, and then also creates something different of Black women too, as the lazy woman, as the welfare queen, as horribly during this period of time, the crack mom, which hopefully we might get there too, right? The stereotyping and stigmatization that you spent time fighting against, Rebecca. You know, Kate, there's another thread of this too, which deals with religion as well. And this is something that has come up in your writing, in your experience, the way in which religion was an influence. And can you unpack that? Because it's not all, you know, today when you think about it, there's, you know, sort of religion being weaponized against rights. But what's also interesting during that period is that it's not all religion that's against women's rights and women's equality or even reproductive health and rights. Can you unpack just a little bit of what that landscape looked like?
Yeah, so just so folks know, my background, I was raised Mormon, and a very, if not one of the most patriarchal systems. It operates on an explicit patriarchy. That's what it's called. It's called the patriarchal order. So they're not hiding it. It's an explicit patriarchy. And so that's the context in which I came to feminism. And I think it's important for us to understand that religion is a tool, that religion, particularly in this period, but ever since the beginning, no matter what wave we're talking about, religion has been a very important tool, primarily in the oppression of women. And so I think if we're using the anti-choice movement as an example, you know, there isn't a secular anti-choice movement. The anti-choice movement is religious and particular religions. In the United States, it's primarily Catholicism and evangelicalism, and then some other folks who join in this band with the common enemy of women's health and freedom. And so I think while there are, you know, traditions that use religion, there's liberation theology, there's all these other things that can be used for good, and that can be used as a tool of liberation. For the most part, the folks who have really co-opted religious narratives and have used it the most effectively are folks who are anti-freedom, who are, have some very specific goals in mind, and they've been the most effective in this period. That's not to say there aren't progressive people who are motivated by religion. Certainly there are, but again, specifically in this period, it's really ramped up and gotten so much more extreme even than it ever was. If you read, I think it's so interesting that you're reading these diaries. If you read, narratives from feminists or suffragists, even from before women got the vote, they were motivated by religion in some very different ways. Like Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a woman's Bible and replaced all of the male pronouns with female pronouns and made all the stories about women. Like, she was very dedicated to the fact that religion was being used as a tool against women. And so I think in this period, it's really ramped up to become such a wedge and such a controlling factor. And that's primarily to it's centered around women's rights, but bleeds into all of these different things.
I wonder too with that, how much of that is kind of white religion based? Because I'm also thinking about 1966, Dr. King receives Planned Parenthood's inaugural Margaret Sanger Award and writes this brilliant speech where he says that civil rights and women's rights go hand in hand. And he talks about how an agrarian economy is inconducive with women's rights, right? He says, coming from a space where, you're having 10 kids because you got to, work the fields is not conducive to living in a 1-bedroom tenement. And he goes on from there in a really brilliant and compassionate way as he's speaking to women's liberation as being tied to civil rights. And so I'm wondering, and I'll get you back in here, Rebecca, in terms of your thinking about that. I mean, certainly we do see misogyny in Black religious culture. It can exist as well, but how do we fit religion and the pushback against the third wave into this conversation?
Yes, I think that's such a great question. Another one of the things that we talked about within third wave, I mean, I had a whole list of things that I felt defined third wave. And one of them was a conversation about spirituality and about making space for women who did believe in God, who did believe in divinity, who did believe in another transcendent energy that was bigger than them, that fed them, that was nourishing. And often that was living in women of color and the lives of women of color. We have come out of a very powerful tradition of Christianity, which is not, I'm a Buddhist, but which has not been the traditional Christianity. We have used the spaces of the church to as a radicalizing space from which to evolve our politic, evolve our community, evolve ourselves so that we can actually survive the brutal inhumanity that we have faced for hundreds of years here. So there was the moment when it felt like white women were saying that we had to be secular, almost like a communist, idea. We had to be secular in order to be empowered. And women of color, that doesn't speak to, I think, generally our deep sense of faith and our understanding of the importance of the church as a container for us to evolve as a people and fight back. So that was something that we talked a lot about, of making that space. And back to the journals of women on the plantation, I really think that we continue to struggle as people of color with a profound fear and caution and skepticism around the intentions of white women in general. And I think that's something that is a part of the ongoing tensions within feminism. When we read some of these narratives now, we can see the brutality that white women were inflicting on Black bodies, Black beings. I'm forgetting the name of the book, but the moment in which the mistress of the home is rocking her chair, over the neck of the young Black woman who's taking care of her child. I mean, the brutality of white women and the way their position behind supporting the Klan, supporting slavery, supporting, So I think this is something that women of color, people of color live with, think about, struggle with. And at this point, really, and I'm happy to say this, I think that we are much more comfortable demanding a kind of accountability from white women for their position of privilege, for their connection to the oppression of people of color for the last 400 years. And I think that's an important thing that we contributed with third wave that has evolved, I think, in a very powerful way. I see many, many more people of color willing to take that conversation to the mat, to just say, you know what, I can't, I just, and I think in some ways that's about self-preservation. I think that is a level of self-empowerment for women of color.
And it's
And I
newer
think
too,
it's very
Rebecca,
good
right?
for white women to actually have to grapple with that and really look at themselves and how they are using their privilege every single day.
So we saw quite a bit of the in the last year and a half in the wake of COVID, the deaths of Breonna Taylor, killings, murders, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, um, Ahmaud Arbery, and the park scene. You know, what was also so triggering too, Amy Cooper in the park, where in real time, it was kind of like a slow motion film of America, here you are. The things that people of color have been saying, the things that Black people have been saying. And as awful as we heard about Breonna Taylor and the murder in her bedroom, in her apartment with a no-knock warrant, the lynching that we saw in the streets of Minneapolis with an officer looking straight into the camera for almost 9 minutes as he snuffed out the life of somebody. Seeing in that park, Amy Cooper, who is supposed to have her dog leash, she's breaking the law, but the weaponized cell phone, the weaponized 911 call on this innocent birder who's just saying, would you please leash your dog? And knowing what can be on the other side of the police coming in a situation where a white woman claims to have been assaulted by a Black man, and that we got to see that, right?
Yes.
In a way that we didn't get to see what was inside the candy store with Emmett Till.
Yes.
Leslie, so it's with this kind of backdrop and these kinds of tensions, what's being worked out then in the third wave on these kinds of issues? I mean, was the third wave successful in addressing these interconnected, these intersecting issues?
I think so, in that was that was there from the beginning. That was the definition. That was, like Rebecca, I think everybody gives you credit for writing like that first essay in 1992. That's where, like, any of us in academia, I think, I don't know what was happening in the general public, but I know anybody within academia was like, oh, wait, this is the first time we've heard this. Oh my God, thank you, because it was all feminist theory then. Like, within academia, it was feminist theory, and it was very, it was so divorced from any kind of real language. It was so cerebral. It was all French feminism and Lucie Irigaray and Julia Kristeva, and all that stuff was great, but it was so narrow.
Yes.
And I know any of us that came through, like, in the 80s into the early 90s, we're so longing for something to, like, bring us back to earth, to address what was actually happening in the world. And we didn't have that within feminism in the academy at that time at all. And I think it was, third wave, as led by Rebecca, that really forced that conversation, like, that forced older academics to take that seriously and to start looking at intersectionality and saying, oh, look, here's all the debts that feminism has to women of color, that has to third world feminism, that we've got to stay here, we've got to go from this point, because anything else just isn't doing anything for us. We're all just talking to each other.
So what about the costs of that, Kate, right? So in thinking about expanding the conversation and where it went and where it didn't go, so I'm thinking about Audre Lorde, for example, and other intersections and what was missed. So I'm going to put out something to you, Kate, that's kind of a comment, less of a question, because there are a number of things that I'm thinking about. So I'm thinking about Rebecca doing that work, but a cost to that work, right? So from this point of view, one can look and say, Rebecca, great that you did that. But I'm also thinking, I know that women of color had lots of pushback when they did that, right? Like, at the time, like, why are you disturbing the apple cart? Right? You've now accused us of things that we don't feel comfortable being accused of. And then there are the pragmatic kinds of issues that we could look at then and we could look at today. I remember being a student and saying, where are the women of color who should be hired in this department?
Yes.
Where are they? So Kate, it's comment, less of a question. Fill in on the missing kinds of parts and the tensions, which still kind of exist, because you're still trying, even in the current wave, to get a conversation to be broader and deeper.
Yeah, so I think the things that still, I didn't grow up learning. again, I grew up in a very, very, very conservative household. I'm not learning about the waves. I went to Brigham Young University, also known as the Lord's University. And so we didn't have feminist theory. We didn't have, there's nothing like that. So I learned a lot of this as an adult. And I think it's interesting as I look back and I relearn a lot of the history and kind of the categories and all these different things. It seems to me that the lessons that we don't learn repeat themselves, and then we have a new wave and it's like, well, we still didn't learn that lesson, and by that lesson I mean racism, and so I think these things tend to repeat themselves and will until we learn that lesson, and so I think the conversations we're having now, folks have mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw, and there are others. I think of Polly Murray, who was a pioneering transgender legal theorist, Episcopal priest, incredible person, who coined the term Jane Crow, about the intersections of Polly's experience with race and gender. And so I think these are lessons that Black women in particular and women of color have been pointing to and have been bringing up in every wave, and have been demanding. And I think one of the things that's so interesting or so compelling about the third wave, and now that we've moved into the next wave, we still haven't learned the lesson, but folks are being more assertive, or at least I'm hearing, as a white woman, I'm hearing them more, and as I learn, and really taking accountability. I think the Amy Cooper example is one 5-minute interaction that they had, but was a really impactful as a society, because we got to see a really concrete example of how this fragility, how this racism, how all of this can put people's lives in danger in a very specific way.
It also brings something else to mind for me, the kind of proof that generally that women have had to bring, but when I think about Black people, Black women, have to sort of, it's not enough to say. It's not enough that we should be able to intuit. It's not enough that the receipts are all scattered around us, right? It's that we need actual real video, right, of things happening in order to be taken seriously. But I want to turn to the ERA and then talk a little bit about family and how we sort of balance feminism and family. So Kate, with your work on the ERA, which you've been so passionate about, so committed to, so what progress was made through the third wave or not?
Yeah, so again, women of color have been at the forefront of the Equal Rights Amendment all the way to the modern day. And I think that's something that's largely lost in the discourse about the ERA. When you see pictures, it's like white women with banners, it's, all these Gloria Steinem from the 1970s. And of course, that was a piece of it. But all along the way, women of color have been pushing for the ERA, and Polly Murray, for example, testified in support of the ERA in Congress in the 1970s. So the ERA, the deadline that was imposed by Congress expired in 1982. And I like to say it took a rest, or there was a pause on the ERA. Not that it died, there was a pause. And there all along have been people, specifically feminists, who never gave up on the Equal Rights Amendment. And particularly in 1992, when the 27th Amendment was ratified, and folks were like, wait, so it's called the Madison Amendment because James Madison first proposed it. And folks are like, wait, so that 200 years is not too long of a period to finally ratify something. Certainly 30 isn't. And so it was in the 1990s, and specifically 1992, when folks came up with what's called the three-state solution. So that we could get these 3 additional states that we missed out on in the first time and get them to ratify. And that's really when that theory began to be put forward. And now we're seeing that again, put forth by women of color. Pat Spearman, who's a queer Black preacher in Nevada, who's also a senator, got miraculously the Equal Rights Amendment ratified in Nevada in 2017. So there were people all along who never gave up, even though that nationwide push was much quieter in this period.
Well, and we still see that struggle taking place today with regard to the ERA, and momentum still there with the ratification by the last 3 states within the last few years. But that says a lot too, right? Because when we think about the anti-movement, right, Phyllis Schlafly, et cetera, right, what does that look like, and how does that tie into a term that we can use today, but that would have been frowned upon a decade ago, white supremacy, right? Which is very, very interesting, right? Like 10 years ago, to have brought that up in an academic conversation, one would have been dismissed from the stage. This is hyperbole, extremism, race card, ultra left, all the rest of that. But after the death of Heather Heyer, storming of the Capitol on January 6th, all of these different things, now we can admit that white supremacy has been, has been institutionalized in some ways in our country. I'd like to expand the conversation to think about family in the third wave. Because sometimes when we think about these waves and we think about feminism, sometimes it has this kind of way of being framed as it's just about a woman alone and not about other parts of the community and whatnot. And so, Rebecca, I want to come back to you in terms of thinking about, well, third wave, did it have a kind of family component or a way of thinking about community that was apart from just the individual? And I'll open this up to you and Leslie.
Okay, I have a lot of things to say. I think I like that you keep asking about what did we achieve. And I think that's a very important question. And I could say, I believe that we achieved many things. I think that we did not lose a generation. The fact that we have such an active intersectional women's movement that is completely, when I think about Women's March, I just did a film about Women's March, and thinking about all of the different women of color who put that massive march on. I mean, that is a result of third wave. I mean, I don't want to take credit for it, but we forged those connections and those ideas that we should all be working together. And it should be about immigration. It should be about, abuse of all of that. When I think about same-sex marriage, I feel that is a real, that is about the third wave. That is about people using their privilege, white women understanding, white men understanding, that we all need to stand up for one another. That was an intersectional movement. It wasn't just gay people who made same-sex marriage happen, and on and on and on. So I think that, and even to this very day, the response to George Floyd, to seeing how many white people have been able to step forward, specifically white women, and champion and stand for it in an integrous way for the rights of Black people is a result of this work that we have been doing. And it's not just third wave, it's the wave before, it's all of it. But I really feel connected to that. So, and I could go on about some of the successes. I think it's sort of fashionable to say that we weren't successful in any way, but again, that's an erasure of what we actually
absolutely. And I think that's a really important point that you make, and I don't mean to interrupt before you go on, but taking that time and space to actually name it is critically important, because there is always, sadly, erasure is what has been the norm, right?
Exactly.
I wish that it were different, right?
Yes.
But erasure,
it's as if we haven't done anything at all and we've built the entire country. It's just ridiculous. So, but then, yes, and then again, to your point about family, one of the, again, a main principle of third wave had to do with saying that we are not independent, that independence is not the goal. And what we had come to and what we had absorbed from second wave was that you should be independent, you should make your own money, you should not need a man, you should not need anyone but yourself. And what we were saying was that actually the goal was interdependence, healthy interdependence. And that came specifically from communities of color who refused to reject the men in their communities and in their families in the name of feminism. There was an understanding that we all had to move forward together because we had needed each other to survive for so long. That the idea of being independent, separate from everyone else, was ridiculous. It was absurd. It was unsustainable. And so again, that's an idea of third wave that has been lost, and it was very, very important. I remember writing about two of the most famous women in our country at the time who were on television saying, "I've got $20 million. I don't need a man," and laughing about it. And for me, that was heartbreaking because we do need each other. The message is not that we can live these discrete lives. The message is that human beings are communal beings. We must grow together or we will perish. So, so I feel that's very embedded within third wave. Whether or not that's been remembered, again, I wrote one article in Ms. Magazine. Then I published an anthology of third wave writings by women who were coming to their own voice about feminism. I spoke at 100 universities articulating all of these ideas. I feel that I really try to champion and support a whole generation with these ideas, and many of them have been completely lost and undervalued.
It's hard to hold, right? I mean, it's hard to hold
White
space
supremacy,
when,
basically,
yeah, and and a lack of institutions being institutionally responsive and doing the work of hiring and whatnot. Those pieces actually matter quite a bit. So Leslie, I wanted to hear from you on that family piece too, but I want to actually, maybe because time is running out and I wish it weren't. So I wish that we have the opportunity to retreat on this with some fireplaces and whatever your libation is, whether it's sparkling water or wine or sparkling wine, that we could get together and have just a full-on weekend of this kind of engagement. I want to circle us back to reproductive health, rights, and justice as a part of this conversation and the third wave. What did that look like? Because for many people, Roe was the panacea. But if you unpack and go a little bit lower, after Roe, there were a series of cases that made it very difficult if you were a poor woman, a low-income woman, a woman of color, to be able to access, even being able to have an abortion because of state and federal laws that said that state and federal money could not be used if you wanted to terminate a pregnancy, only if you wanted to continue on. So Leslie, could you speak any to that?
I don't have any particular legal expertise or anything, but what I would say about the sort of the third wave getting lost and buried, which, it really did seem to. It was, within larger popular culture, within academia, there was so much, oh, feminism is the F word, you can't even say it. Students weren't interested. They didn't want that, I was doing my work on women in sports to kind of sneak it in through the back door, it was the only way I could do it. But this issue of reproductive rights was like the one thing that I think kept everybody kind of terrified and in there. And like, to some extent, labels don't matter when you have to face something that fundamental. And there were, all the violence of the bombing the abortion clinics, like I said, that seemed like that escalated, through the 2000s. And there's the shooting of women in schools, and it just, the violence really was something that, no matter what label you wanted to deny, if you want to say, oh, I'm not a feminist, but that was like a favorite saying during those years. That the reproductive rights question was still a fundamental thing that people did unite around. And I think it's really important that Rebecca was pointing to, like, the importance of the men who supported us, and that we're not, it wasn't this opposition between men and women, and the men who are supporting reproductive rights. So that it does seem like that is a fundamental baseline that, regardless of these labels, it's something that people continue to hold on to. Is like, we have to fight this fight.
Yes. That's interesting too, the labels that come out of this time, right? So there's the date rape in terms of rape on campus. There's the high-tech lynching terminology that comes about in Clarence Thomas during his judicial confirmation hearings, where he says that the probing and investigating of the allegations of his sexual harassment and assault of women who worked with him was a high-tech lynching. And we see, sort of the bantering around of the ways of terms being used in ways to sort of push back at, to cabin off in various ways the concerns that are being made by women, by feminists. And so going forward, because we've just reached that time where we're running out of time. So I want to know, what's the silver lining going forward? There's so much more that I would have to ask you, because I'm just in the space of brilliance right now, brilliance personified. But I'm wondering, what's the silver lining going forward from the third wave, fourth wave? I'll start with you, Kate.
Yeah, so I'm just so thankful for people who held the line during the third wave and created this like intellectual curiosity and robust framework that we're benefiting from now. And I think that's the silver lining to me of the third wave, is a lot of the tools and language and, you know, really rich culture and, you know, intersectionality and all of these things were created in the third wave and are what we're using to take forward. And I think, you know, feminism is cool again. We've gone from not being a feminist to, or saying I respect women, but I'm not a feminist, to feminism being cool again. We're in this period of backlash, but with backlash comes a rediscovering of the important parts of the framework that we needed all along. So that's what I think is kind of the silver lining, is that we have these tools. We need to be crediting the people who made them, clearly, as Rebecca has pointed out, but we have them and that we're using them to go forward, and we've learned some lessons from the past. And so there's unfinished business from the previous waves, but we're moving forward in a new way, and that we do have this rich history to rely on to move us forward and learn from the past.
Leslie, silver lining going forward. What have we learned?
For me, I don't know that I have any very academic or, you know, brainy way of articulating it, but it's been such a joy for me to see my daughter, who's now 16, the way she and her cohort, they take all these things for granted, right? Like they like that identity is made up of multiple facets, that, you know, that lots of people are biracial, that lots of people don't consider themselves one gender or another, and that's normal, and that's, you know, to them, they don't even bat an eyelash, you know. It's just like that's how it is, you know. And that's so fundamentally different. It's like they know what's wrong, they know what to look for, they know how to call people out, and they do. I get called out sometimes. It's like I still suffer from that, you know, hardcore sports socialization, what, you know, Rebecca was talking about, with the privileging of like the individual will and all of that stuff, you know, like that's cost me more than I can possibly articulate in a lifetime. And it's like to see my daughter not living under that, and to belong to a number of different communities and just kind of take that for granted. That seems to me to be, okay, that's what third wave was trying to do in the first place. So yeah, there's all this horrible, horrible, horrible stuff going on. And, you know, we're in this context of how it's almost beyond being able to talk about it. And then with all the problems with climate change and everything, on top of that, it's just, you know, that generation has so much to deal with, but they have this resilience, they have this strength that I think comes from that kind of intersectional coalitional model, where they don't see themselves as separate and alone and having to conquer the world.
Thanks so much. Rebecca, I want to close out with you.
I think this is a really interesting question. The silver lining, I think there are many, and Leslie and Kate have talked about some very important ones. I also feel that the silver lining has to do with the way in which women of color specifically now are feeling a kind of the right to take care of ourselves, the right to, you know, I wrote a piece recently about leaving the intellectual plantation, you know, no longer wanting to work, you know, to give my intellectual labor away in trying to raise the consciousness of white people, of needing to turn, you know, into my tradition and my sense of well-being. And I think that women of color of different cultural communities are feeling more and more empowered to speak in their own language, to set the terms of what empowerment looks like, to join together as activists in very specific and different ways than white women have in the past. I see that kind of self-respect, self-reliance, a real understanding of what our power is, where it lies, and that it doesn't necessarily benefit from just, spilling out from us endlessly, but from holding some of it. And I think that's really, I'm really happy to see that. And I know in my cohort, we talk a lot about my friends, Black joy, Black freedom, Black brilliance, Black genius. I think a lot of that is about the way in which within third wave, coming through third wave, we were able to say that we are different and we bring something important that's different. And our energy, our life energy is critical and we need it for us. So I see a lot of that as a real silver lining. But I also want to say that I'm deeply concerned, as I know all of us are, but I feel, very concerned about, the not so silver lining, has to do with the ongoing abuses of going too far, possibly in the other direction. So, I'm very concerned about, I think Me Too is an important movement, but it's also runs the risk of contributing to the ways in which white women are able to, draw Black men in particular as predatory, as rapists, as people who need to be surveilled and contained and controlled in a certain way. So I think we need to look at some of the problematics of it. Also but to go back to the silver lining, I'm loving the Karen movement. I don't know what you all are thinking about that, but the sort of exposure of white women who have just gone to, these extraordinary lengths, and you see them acting, hysterically against Black people and Black sovereignty. And I think that exposure is a kind of silver lining, the feeling that we can expose this, and by exposing it, we can help everyone to grow through it and understand what's really going on and what has been going on for a very long time. So I could go on about that, but it's a complicated picture. But fundamentally, I think the silver lining is that we're all here together talking about this, and that a lot of these conversations are happening, and they need to happen.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Kate. And for those of you tuning in this evening, thank you so much for joining us.